My number 5 on the Orioles worst offseason moves is December 2014, the year they didn't re-sign Nelson Cruz, and then he went to Seattle for 4 years and $57 million.
Yeah,
So
that
yeah,
sucked real bad.
it was well. If you remember, he had that awesome year with the Orioles that year, and then he was coming into his age 34 season, and the Orioles were like, "We'll give you 3 years," and he's like, "I really want four," and they're like, "How would you like three?" And then he went to Seattle and he got the fourth year, and he averaged 40 homers a year for the next 4 years, and he was an all-star for three of those. So that was fun.
I was going to say, would it have killed you to have given him that fourth year for 40 home runs? It was inexplicable.
He won two Silver Sluggers there too, which is fun. But yeah, his power never declined. That was the Dan Duquette special where he thought he could predict players' declines. He's going all the dumpster diving he would do. So that is my number 5. What is your number 5?
My number 5 actually goes back to 1988. And that was the year that they traded Mike Young, outfielder Mike Young, to the Phillies for third baseman Rick Shue and a couple other nondescript players. Mike Young didn't go on to have a great career. In fact, he retired or was out of baseball in the next year and a half. But Rick Shue helped the Orioles in that year, 1988, lose their first 21 games of the season. The story behind Rick Shue is back in 1985, he replaces Mike Schmidt for the Phillies at third base. Mike Schmidt then goes to first base. Rick Shue goes and he becomes their new, third base power guy. They're expecting 40 home runs out of him. I think he hit like 14. 1986, they put him back on the bench. They put Mike back at third base. Then by 1988, he gets traded to the Orioles, where he hits a sparkling 256 with 4 home runs and 21 RBIs in that ill-fated 1988 season. So that's my number 5, Rick Shue. Thank you very much.
Yeah, that's disgusting. Like those numbers, like I'm sure they thought they would be awesome when he signed him, but I have a really good one. My number
Okay.
4 pick is February 2014. The Orioles signed Ubaldo Jimenez to a 4-year, $50 million contract. Do you remember Ubaldo?
Uh, our hearts sank when that happened because everybody universally said this guy is going to be terrible. He had that one year where he dominated, and we're and for I think it was for Cleveland. Was it
Yep.
Cleveland or Colorado? I can't
Well,
remember, but he was dominant, and then he had some so-so years. The Orioles signed him. I think they felt compelled to sign him because either the Yankees or Red Sox had signed somebody that they wanted. So I think he was just like, one of these picks where they just had to do something. So they went and did this horrible thing.
yeah. So I think in 2010 he pitched a no-hitter with the Rockies, and then he had a really great year. And then a couple of years, and then 13 with the Indians, he was 13-9 with a 3.30 ERA, and he made 32
Right.
starts. And even when they signed him, they're like, "Oh, I mean, this guy's great, but like he's still kind of inconsistent." And here's his ERAs for the 4 years he was in Baltimore. You ready for this?
I can't.
4.81, 4.11, 5.44, 6.81.
Nice. And of course, you remember he gave up that big hit. The last time the Orioles got into the playoffs, which I think was
16.
2016, and they're doing that one game playoff with Toronto. And instead of putting your closer in there in a tie game in the 10th inning, you go ahead and you put Ubaldo in there, and he just goes ahead and gives up the gopher ball, and then you're done. And
Yep.
then, of course, it's all been downhill from there. So thank you, Ubaldo, for all of what you did, which was virtually nothing
We
good
should
anyway.
have signed Irvin Santana. He was the other guy they should
That
have.
was the pick. Kansas City picked up Irvin Santana. That's right.
Yep. So then they're like, I guess we'll give this guy money. Who's your number 4?
Number 4, we're going to go back to 1986. You kind of see a trend developing here. And that's the year, June of 1986, that they finally give up on pitcher Dennis Martinez. And Dennis had pitched for the Orioles in a couple World Series, 79. He was with them when they won in 1983. And he battled problems with alcoholism. So he had successfully mastered that, but unfortunately his numbers had gotten bad in 84, 85, and by 86, they had just really given up on him. So they trade him to Montreal basically for whoever you want to send us. And I don't even know who they got. a minor leaguer that never amounted to anything, I'm sure. He goes on with the Expos to win like another 100 games. He is an all-star 3 times with the Expos. He's Latin America's winningest pitcher with 245 wins. And so I just felt like that was a strong number 4 there, because he was a guy that really could have helped them through the tough years in the late 80s, and especially that year, 1989, when they're competing with the Toronto Blue Jays. They're battling for the pennant right on through the last 2 weeks of the season. So that was really a bad move on their part.
Didn't he have an awesome nickname or something? Wasn't he like El Presidente or something?
I think so. Yes. Yes.
Yeah, that's really bad. Though whoever was the talent evaluator back then really didn't have any idea what they were doing, I'm assuming.
The Orioles have a knack for trading pitchers that they're going to need later on. They
I
really do.
have a couple honorable mentions about that. But
Okay.
yeah, that's a good one. My number 3 pick, and this goes back to November 1998. The Orioles signed Albert Bell to a 5-year, $65 million contract. Do you remember Albert Bell? What did you think when they finally brought him over? Because he was like a 40 homer guy.
I remember being excited. The Orioles had won in 96 and 97. They had 97. They had a team that should have gone to the World Series, and the Indians knocked them out. But I remember being excited and thinking, okay, the Orioles are really gearing up. They're going for it now. But I also remember thinking, this is not a good guy. He's not a clubhouse guy. He's not a people person. He's this, lonely, brooding, moody guy. And how's this going to work? And you just hoped that it was going to work out. And I don't think anybody was surprised that it didn't.
He had that thing in Cleveland where he like berated, I think it was Hannah Storm, the reporter, until he got fined $50,000 because he verbally assaulted her, and to the point where she was like inconsolable. So that's a great locker room guy. I'm glad but I guess they're like, okay, well, he's the only player to ever have 50 homers and 50 doubles in the same year. Fun fact.
Very good. Yeah, I didn't know that.
So he was an Oriole for 2 years. He had 2 pretty good years for him. He had like 30 homers and 37 homers, and then he had like 28 the next year, or 23 the next year, and then he had that degenerative hip condition that just made him retire.
Right, and I was reading actually that he was going to be one of my picks. He's an honorable mention on my list, but I remember reading that he had some clause in his contract that for 3 years he had to be the highest paid player on the roster. So that means he's not playing, yet they can't sign anybody else for big money because they've already made this agreement with him. So he was just really the ultimate, jerkwad signing. And I don't remember who the GM was that did this, but he really should have been ashamed of himself.
He should have. But who's your number 3?
Number 3, I'm going to go back to 1981, and it's going to be Doug DeCinces. They trade their third baseman, Doug DeCinces, to the Angels for outfielder Dan Ford. Disco Dan Ford. Disco Dan. That was his nickname. And they had wanted him for a while. They tried to trade for him the previous season. They just couldn't get the deal done. So finally, in the offseason 1981 going into 82, they finally get Dan Ford. And his first year with the Orioles was just atrocious, 1982. You remember that year, they're battling the Brewers all season long. They end up finishing the season 1 game behind the Brewers with 94 wins. The Brewers had 95 that year. If Dan Ford had a good year that year, that probably would have been enough to push him over the top. As it was, he didn't. Now, he did win the World Series. Dan Ford does win the World Series with the Orioles in 1983, and he's a big part of that team. But in the 4 years that he's with the club, he hits some ridiculous amount of home runs, like, 42 or something. No, actually, he hits. I'll take that by half. He hits 21 home runs in 4 years. DeCinces leaves the Orioles. He's traded to the Angels. He almost helps the Angels to the World Series in 1986. He hits about 130 home runs with the Angels over the 6 years that he plays with them. And you just have to think back to the Orioles teams of 82. What could have DeCinces have done to help them to get over the hump in 82? Would he have helped them? Probably not enough in 84 to make a difference, because the Tigers won a bunch of games that year. But some of the other years, 86, 87, would he have been a stabilizing force. And with his defense at third base, he was no Brooks Robinson, but he
Mhm.
was darn good. So and the Orioles really didn't replace him at third base until Ripken moves over from short to third, in my opinion. So I take that as my number three. I just think they should have held on to DeCinces even with his back issues, and had that defense and those home runs. I think they would have been a lot better off.
I think I read DeSensei called Earl Weaver coach, or was it Skip, or he called him coach or something, and then
Calls him coach.
he calls him coach, and Earl was just, he did not like that. It's just bringing back a lot of weird random facts from all the books I would read about these teams.
Sure.
But all right, that's a really good one. I have for my number two pick, January 1991. The Orioles trade Curt Schilling, Steve Finley, and Pete Harnisch to the Astros for Glen Davis.
Yeah.
That's, I mean, right off the bat, Curt Schilling, he should be in the Hall of Fame. His numbers were amazing after that. Goes on to play and was it Philly, and he helps the Diamondbacks and the Red Sox, all these other teams after. Finley was a reliable guy. He just Gold Glove after Gold Glove. Harnisch was the All-Star in 1991, the year after they traded him. Pitched for another 12 years. And Glen Davis, I think, is regarded as one of the worst first basemen in Oriole history.
That's true. And there was a local publication that actually declared that he was the absolute worst. And the shame of it was the Orioles had such high hopes when they brought him in from Houston. He was going to be the home run guy. And I mean, here's a guy. I mean, you want to talk about somebody that needed a 4-leaf clover. It was Glen Davis. He needed a rabbit's foot to carry around with him. I think he ended up on the injured reserve list one year because he gets hit in the dugout with a foul ball. I mean, he just had the worst luck, and he hit nothing. He really just virtually hit nothing. He was supposed to be the big home run guy. I think maybe his tops was like 13 home runs in 1992. So I'm with you. I think it was a terrible trade. It may be the worst of all time. Who knows?
I think ESPN called it like the second worst trade of all time. But yeah, you give up on Curt Schilling, and then he just goes on to have like a 20-year career after that. That was amazing. So,
Yeah.
Who's your number two pick?
My number two, I'm going again. I'm kind of staying in the 80s. My number two that year is 1985. The Orioles, as you remember, in '83 win the World Series with new manager Joe Altobelli. Basically, he wins it with Earl Weaver's team, and I think that while that may be an unfair assessment, I think it's pretty accurate. So in '84, you see the real managing going on when the Orioles drop from World Series winner to 85 wins and I don't know 20 some games behind the Tigers for the division. And so 85 is really the bounce back year. And so Altobelli stumbles out of the gate. They fire him mid-season and they bring back Earl Weaver. So part of the deal with Earl Weaver in 1985 is, okay, I'll take over the team. You got to get me some speed in the infield. Trade for Alan Wiggins. And so they work out a deal with San Diego. They bring Alan Wiggins in. And he does okay the first half season. He plays 70 some games. He hits 285. He steals about 30 bases. He's a spark plug for the team. The Orioles were terrible that year, but he's a bright spot. So there is hope going into the following season, 86. And that's when things really fall apart. He doesn't run out ground balls. He doesn't practice. Practice. We're talking about practice. It's not a game. It's practice. Well, he doesn't. He doesn't run out ground balls. He doesn't practice very well. The fans turn on him, and he ends up only playing 3 years for the Orioles, and they end up replacing him with Rick Burleson, I think, in the '87 season. They bring up Billy Ripken, and Wiggins ends up being a utility guy at that point, which he's not happy with. He had a lot of problems. He had a lot of emotional problems. He had drug problems. There was a cocaine addiction that he was dealing with, and he actually dies in 1991, which is very, very sad. But you look at that trade, and with the expectations they had, and that team in '86 that loses 42 out of the last 56 games. I mean, just a total disaster. And that really puts the Orioles on a run of bad seasons that doesn't let up until 1996. So I picked that one because of the disappointment factor, but also the factor that the Orioles just really tank there on out, except for that one bright spot, in '89.
I like it. Yeah, that I think he was really good with the Padres. The Padres were good back in the early '80s, I think.
'84, he helps them to the World Series, and
Yeah.
he's a 1-2 punch. At the top of the lineup there, he steals 5 bases in one game. I mean, he's a superstar, but the drug issues, the emotional issues, and finally the Padres give up on him in '85, and obviously we know what happened at that point. At one point, the Orioles send him back down to AAA Rochester. I mean, they don't know what to do with him, and so it was just very, very sad.
Dang. Okay. Well, now we're in rarefied air here. This is the number one pick for the worst Orioles offseason move. My pick is going to be January 2016, re-signing Chris Davis to a 7-year, $161 million deal with 42
Yeah,
of that deferred until 2037.
yeah, that sucked, didn't it?
I think as far as bad baseball contracts go, if that's not 1 or 1A, I mean you're not being truthful, because Crush Davis had all those great years in 2013. He goes to the All-Star game. He starts as our first baseman. He has like 53 home runs. And then he had 2014 he got hurt with the pop for the Adderall. 2015, he comes back to lead the American League in homers again. And then management's like, all right, we got to keep this guy. We got to keep him. And so they threw all this money at him. And then here's his home run counts since then. 2016, he had pretty good years, 38. That's a pretty Chris Davis year. 2017, 26. 2018, 16. 2019, he had 12. And they can't find creative ways. They can't find enough creative ways to not play him at this point.
And you're paying him all that money. How do you just let him go? I mean, you have to keep him and hope that he can produce again. But the fact is, he's getting older every year. He's a year older now than he was last year when he only hit 12 home runs. So what do you do with this guy? What's funny is I remember the negotiation process, and all of the papers are going, all the reporters are going, hey, the Orioles really don't have any competition for re-signing this guy. So they end up kind of competing with themselves. They're bidding against themselves for this guy, and they finally gets this huge contract. So I'm with you. I think it's probably the worst, other than the Albert Bell thing and the Nelson Cruz thing. I mean, you look at worst decisions of all time. Boy, that's a great choice.
It really is. And I think he had a great spring training this year. When I talked to Rock Kabako, I asked him, I was like, have they ever considered cutting this guy? They're like, they can't. They've never considered it. It's too much money. So it's fun watching him play like once a week, and it's great. So that is my number one pick. I'm curious to see if you're going to stay in the '80s or you're going to go somewhat modern for number one.
I'm moving a little bit out of the '80s, but not far. I'm going to 1990, and actually, your number two is my number one choice, and that's the trade for slugger Glen Davis. And they trade two really good pitchers. Steve Finley goes on to win a World Series with Arizona. We all know about Curt Schilling's success, with Boston and Arizona. The bloody sock game. These were quality guys that the Orioles had, and they just threw them away for this guy that that didn't really do anything. The Baltimore City paper was the publication that names him the Orioles' worst first baseman in their history. You bring this guy in. So Davis is expected to hit 40 home runs with the Orioles. His best year is 13 in 1992. He gets in a bar fight, and he misses most of the 1993 season with a broken jaw. He gets hit in the head with a foul ball and misses a month on the disabled list. And finally, he gets in a fight with his manager, Johnny Oates, who was the Orioles, a catcher for the Orioles in the 60s. Johnny Oates is the manager, gets in a fight with him, gets benched, and mercifully never plays again.